they could just guess bits at random, and they will get half of those right. And when we're only doing 3 bits, then that's not very good, but in practice you would do at least 64 bits, and then that significantly reduces the chance. The other thing that the attacker can do is go to the real challenger, the real card, and then ask for all ones or all zeros. Just guess the challenges, and then see what the answer comes back. And with that answer, when the real transaction happens later on, when I hold up one of the flags, if it guessed the flag right, it can give me that back with 50% probability. But even if it guesses wrong, then it can still send me back a random one, and then those will be half. Then that will be right half of the time. So when you combine those 2 attacks, then you get 3/4 of, there's a 75% chance for every bit that the attacker guesses right. And then once you do this 64 times, then you get 1 in 2 to the 26, which is something like 1 in 64 million. So it's very hard to defeat that protocol using this. So another thing the attacker can do is somehow trick the other participant into showing both of the bits, both of the contents of the shift register. And one way to do this is to run the protocol twice. This won't work because the nonce exchange at the beginning will make sure that the contents of the shift register will be different each time. The attacker could also try to sample the challenge early and then send back the response faster than a normal card would do. So rather than when I hold up the flag, the bit comes back, when I just start looking at one, then immediately the response comes back, and that gives a little bit of an improvement on distance, but still not very much. And a final attack is that if the attacker can get both of the bits at the same time. So the evil Matt would run down to the hack center and show both flags very fast, and then the other person will get confused and hand back both of them. But if you design the hardware carefully, then this attack wouldn't work. So we wanted to actually build this, and here you can see the devices that we used. So on the bottom left and here is an FPGA board. We need to use FPGA here in order to get the data back fast enough. FPGAs can respond extremely fast, unlike something like a microcontroller. And the FPGA is here, and here you can see the 2 wires that we used to test. So when we ran the protocol with just a jumper sitting over the 2 wires, then you had a few centimeters distance. The protocol worked, all the bits came back correctly and on time, and the verifier was happy. But when we put these 30-centimeter coax cables, the protocol stopped working. So this shows that we can spot how far away the real card is, even if the attacker is very capable and can send back the responses at the speed of light. And up here, you can see the traces from the inside of the FPGA, and on the scope, you can see the challenges and responses coming back. I'll show you some more pictures of these later. So when you actually want to implement it on a circuit board, you get a circuit diagram like this. If you don't know circuit diagrams, don't worry, I'll explain how it works. So the first step is the challenge being sent. This is where the flag is being held up. So the verifier, shown in green here, wakes up and then drives the I/O line. There's only a single input-output line between the 2 devices. And then the challenge is seen on the wire. Now, this is then delayed very slightly as it travels over the wire, and then the prover, the card, sees a slightly delayed version of this. Now the prover has to work out whether a 1 or a 0 was sent. So a clock line, a separate line, sends a signal to the card to say when to sample it. So here it is being sent, and here it is slightly delayed when it's being received. When the card receives that signal, it looks at whether it's a 1 or a 0 on the I/O line. It then uses this to choose whether the top shift register or the bottom shift register is used to send the response. And once it's worked out what that is, Firstly, it waits a little in order to make sure that it will not send an intermediate state and accidentally send both bits. And once it's waited, it will put the response onto the I/O line, and then this is delayed again, and the response is seen by the verifier. And the final step is once the verifier, the terminal, is happy that the challenge has gone forward and back, it samples the I/O line. And depending on when it samples, it can decide how far away it's willing to tolerate the real card being. So if it samples over here, it means that it thinks the card is going to be very close, and if it samples over here, it thinks the card is going to be very far away. But in the middle, it will get the right answer, but if anything gets in between, then the real response will be shifted way over here, and then the wrong answer will be got, and the protocol will fail. So this diagram shows how it actually works in practice, and in theory, practice is the same as theory. In practice, it isn't. So on the top right-hand corner, you can see the full exchange. So we were doing 64 bits, and over here is just one of these challenge and response pairs. It's actually this one marked by the little black dot. So firstly, the verifier sends the challenge, which is in this case a 1. So it sends it over here, and then slightly later, the prover, the card, sees the same answer on the I/O line. And this thing here is the reflection that's coming back. And then the prover waits a little bit, and at this line, it samples whether it's a 1 or a 0. And then it decides which shift register it's going to use, the top or the bottom one. And then once it's happy it's settled, it now decides here, and it sends a signal back. And you can see that the prover, the card, sends a 0 at this point. And then a little bit later, the verifier, the terminal, sees the response coming back. And again, you've got a reflection. And from here to here is 25 nanoseconds. And in that time, light can only travel about 7.5 meters. So this means if the protocol succeeds, the verifier knows that the card is no further away than 7.5 meters. In practice, when we actually tried it, you can tell whether it's within a few tens of centimeters. And if you used dedicated hardware rather than an FPGA, you could reduce this even more. So the solution that we talked about is quite low cost. It's only a few tens of gates for the core logic, and the rest can be implemented in software. And it does require that there will be changes to the EMV protocol. You need special hardware on the chip and on the terminal to do this. The reason it's cheap is because the card doesn't need to have a fast clock. They normally run at 5 megahertz at the top. It doesn't need to run any faster, so you can use the same processes they use. The terminals do have to run a bit faster because they need to decide when to sample to get the response back accurately. But terminals are already pretty sophisticated. Some of them, the Trintec one even runs Linux, so there's not very much of a problem in making these more sophisticated. And then the cards need to have a few shift registers and some control logic. And then in order for this to work offline, you would also need CDA or DDA. That's a system that's used in most of Europe, apart from the UK, where the card can do public key cryptography. But the contacts between the terminal and the card are unchanged. You still use the same lines. There's one clock line, one bidirectional I/O line, and all the electrical properties stay the same. And most importantly, the customers don't notice any difference. I'll go into some more attacks later, and it's true that criminals are probably not using this attack at the moment. That's only because there are easier attacks to carry out. Our demonstration showed you could do this with a few $100s of investment, and that's well within capabilities of criminal organizations. So although it's not so much of a problem now, as the attackers become more sophisticated and the current loopholes they're exploiting start getting closed off, then it would be worthwhile deploying this or one of the alternative solutions for defeating the relay attack. So this is what criminals are mainly using at the moment. They're not exploiting the chip because the chip is fairly hard to clone. They're just using the magstripe because all cards issued still have the magstripe, and this still works in most ATMs. And one thing to do, which you can see on the right-hand side, is a fraudster who, as he distracts the customer, he first of all swipes the card in the real machine and puts the real transaction through, and then with his other hand, shown over here, he's got another magstripe reader hidden by the side of the cash desk and then swipes it through. And then with this, he gets your account number and all the information that's needed to make a fake magstripe. And this even includes the CVV, which is a three-digit number stored on the magstripe that ATMs use to make sure that the card is legitimate. And a fraudster can either do it by this double swipe attack, or you can intercept the card details as they're sent on the chip, because the chip contains all the same information that's on the magstripe. And then the fraudster has to somehow get the PIN, and the way this is commonly done is simply there's a covert CCTV camera in the ceiling, and this records the PINs that are being entered. They then use the time synchronization to match up which is which, and then make a fake magstripe card. So another way to get the details is intercept them as they're being sent from the chip to the real terminal. And cards already do this as standard. So on this laptop, this was a demonstration for ARD television in, I think, Bavaria at that point. And we put a device between the card and the terminal, which recorded all the data being sent back and forth, which included the CVV, included the name, the account number, and all the information needed to make a fake magstripe. But more importantly, the PIN is also sent between the terminal and the card, so it can verify it correctly. And in most cases, it's not even encrypted. So this means that by intercepting one point, you can get all the data you need. If you don't need the PIN, or you can get the PIN in a different way, then you can also collect the data as it's being sent from the terminal back to the bank. In cases we've seen, that's not encrypted either. And then once you've got the details, you can create a fake card, and it doesn't have a chip, but that's okay, because some ATMs we tested in the UK will still accept cards that should have a chip, but don't. And they do this in order to help foreigners who don't have cards with chips, or just because they'd rather have your custom even though your chip's broken or their card reader's broken, or they just think something's gone a little bit wrong. Also in practice, the fraudsters don't collect the data and then use it themselves. They collect details and then sell it off abroad. Quite often this is done in other countries because their ATMs can't even read the chips. And when we demonstrated it, that this is a UK ATM withdrawing data, withdrawing cash from an account, even though we only had the magstripe. And you don't even need to have a proper magstripe card. You can just use a top-up card, because that's all we had handy at the time. In Germany, this is a little bit different. This is the only country, as far as I know, which uses something called the M feature, which is special encoding of the magstripe that normal card writers can't implement. But that's not a problem, because fraudsters would just steal data from Germany and then send it abroad. So I've given several examples of security problem in chip and PIN, but the banks don't really seem to admit that their system is anything less than flawless. Because if you're the victim of fraud and then you contact your bank, then often they'll just say, our system, it works, the PIN was used, so we're not going to refund you. And there's not very much legal recourse. About the best you can do is go to the Financial Ombudsman Service, who are an independent organisation, but they just seem to be saying the bank's lying back at them. So this is from a letter sent from the Financial Ombudsman to a customer who had been defrauded and tried to get money back. And what the Financial Ombudsman said, the firm, by this they mean the bank, has provided an audit trail of the transactions disputed by you. This shows the location and times of the transactions and evidence the card used was chip read. Now, does this mean that the chip was actually read? Or does this mean that the card should have had a chip, but the bank's records, which are